Hello, welcome to Free Will, Science, and Religion. I'm Chandler Klebs, and I'm here with George Ortega and Michael Walsh. And we're going to talk a little bit about how losing the belief in free will may affect someone's belief in their religion. And this is an interesting case because since I realized free will was an illusion after I already became atheist, I didn't really have any of this problem exactly. It wasn't. I'd already been through the experience of leaving Christianity and all that. But I want to briefly mention for people who are listening to this for the first time, what free will is and why we don't have it, just so we're clear. And basically, free will is that, we could actually make choices independent of anything outside of our control, which is our genetics and our conditioning, or nature and nurture, because anything we do either has to be because we prefer it, because we were genetically predisposed to preferring something, or we were taught something and we get our idea of morality and stuff from what we're taught. So, in short, nobody is the first cause of anything, and that's my brief explanation of why free will is impossible. But maybe George and Mike want to weigh in on that a little bit.
I was just going to say that given the topic, how does one's coming to know that there is no free will affect their religious belief? I mean, I would imagine. I've never been religious myself personally, so it's hard for me to say from a subjective perspective. But looking at other people, I would imagine that it would have a profound effect on their religious worldview because in most religions, free will is an integral part of the whole system of the way things work. Especially most versions of Christianity and Judaism and Islam and Hinduism. And so I can imagine it'd be very hard for me to imagine how someone can still be a traditional theist, believe in a traditional theistic God, like the God of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and accept that there is no free will, because then the whole thing doesn't really make any sense at all. And there have been people who've tried to, reconcile no free will with God, like Calvinists, for example, and there's other groups of people as well. But I would imagine that people who come to realize there's no free will and who are religious, they're going to have an existential crisis at their hands.
Well, Michael, you're right, because that's the kind of crisis that I kind of have come to. On the one hand, understanding that we don't have a free will has been wonderful in that I don't it's illogical and wrong to blame either other people or myself for anything, for anything we might do wrong, and that's wonderful because, like, to the extent we do that, then our relations with other people, with ourselves, with the world of people, just improves. It gets better. We lose the negativity and all. But, the problem is, of course, then, well, all right, from a religious perspective, if we're not responsible for the wrong we do, for the evil we do, then clearly in my mind, God is responsible. So we have to shift from this traditional conception of God as being all good to the recognition of, well, like, God does a lot of good, but he also does a lot of bad. And that is not so easy to come to terms with. Absolutely.
Can you imagine how if a person comes to realize or acknowledges that free will is logically impossible, is it possible that God can have free will?
Chandler, you want to take that, or?
Because does the logical impossibility of free will also apply to God?
It would have to apply to God if there was any sort of God, however you define God, because basically, you are like, oh, for example, our friend Trick has mentioned before that you're stuck either the idea that there's an infinite regressive causality, meaning there's no point at which a decision was ever made. It's just all cause and effect, or if somebody tries to throw an acausal event in there to begin the universe, either way, there is no agent. including God, who could take fundamental responsibility for what happens. So I think that it's just as incoherent for God to have a free will as it is for any human to have a free will.
All right, so Chandler was just addressing the issue from the standpoint of eternity. In other words, if God is eternal, we never reach a point where, like where that causal chain begins. But there's also another way to understand why God, at least in the present moment, doesn't have a free will either. And that relates to God's omniscience. If God is all knowing, then clearly God a billion years ago would have known what God this very moment would be doing, thinking, and all, and God is locked into that knowledge. So you're right, Michael. God doesn't have any more free will in the present moment than anyone else or anything else.
Yeah, I mean, but here's the thing though. Once you expand the zone of the logical impossibility of free will to God Himself, then is the concept of God even coherent after that?
Well, I would probably say no, because at least because you basically have to have a God that as is as powerless as human beings are, and that there is fundamentally no control. So it makes no sense to speak of something being all powerful if it doesn't have the ability to do otherwise.
All right, my take would be a bit different. In other words, like there's basically, we define God as omnipotent or all powerful. But there's certain limitations to that definition. In other words, like an all powerful God cannot make 2 plus 2 equal 5. In other words, like an all powerful God can't do things that would defy God's logic or the world's logic. So from that standpoint, there's a limitation. And then the other thing is like, in terms of like, okay, if you define God as everything, then you kind of like shift from a theistic, or you can shift from a theistic perspective of God to more of a naturalistic understanding and say, well, basically everything is the universe. And so like then when we make that shift, we can say, well, the laws of the universe, gravity, the four physical forces, and all these other laws, the chemical laws and all, that's what makes things happen. So in that sense, God is all powerful. But again, you guys are right that like, because this causal regress, because at least according to logic, causes never stop going back into the past, ultimately it transcends logic. It transcends our ability to understand how God could have like, controlled everything from the very beginning if perhaps there wasn't a beginning.
Yeah, what a lot of religious people that I've spoken to who don't believe in free will is they make an exception for God. They say, well, we don't have free will, but God does. And to me, that doesn't really seem plausible at all. Because, I mean, as you mentioned, if God knows everything, then He knows what He's going to do in 5 minutes. And He can't change it. And He's locked into this infinite or near infinite set of causes and effects, and he's just following along with it, just like we are, and that would be no different from us being determined than as God being determined. And so, what some religious people say to get out of that is, well, God exists outside of time, and that's probably the most popular view of on God, is that God is timeless. But to me, that opens up another logical conundrum because a timeless mind is by definition non-functional. A timeless mind can't do anything. It's just a mind frozen in a conscious state, and it can't make decisions, and it can't do things, and it can't make events happen. So God would have to be in time. But if God's in time, then he couldn't have libertarian free will. And so, the view that some religious people have that, oh, God's outside of time, and that's how he escapes, the free will dilemma, that to me has its own logical dead end.
Yeah, it certainly does have some problems, but I think, like, take for example the Calvinist position that God has free will but humans don't. I think the problem is they haven't explored what free will is. I think that they are thinking that they're still thinking of God as a free agent, as something that could have done otherwise, that this has this will that could be anything and is not bound by any causal laws or anything. Which is weird because I just think that an examination of the issue leads you to the realization that the thought's incoherent for any type of being to have a free will, because it's just a contradiction in terms. Is it free or is it willed? But it can't be both.
Right, again, but I want to get back to, you're right, Michael. Basically, like this contention that God exists outside of not just time, they also say that he exists outside of space also. To my mind, that's incoherent. That's because, like, if you define God, because another definition of God, um, aside from like being, all powerful, omnipotent, and all knowing, omniscient, is that God is supposed to be omnipresent. God is supposed to be everywhere. Now, to my mind, if there is such a thing that exists outside of time and space, God would have to be there, but he would also have to be within, time and space also. Maybe even more to the point, I can't logically conceive of anything existing outside of time and space. Because, like, for example, if you posit the time that God exists outside of time, and then you posit that he existed outside of time a billion years ago and he still exists outside of time today, well, all of a sudden that's not outside of time. A billion years has passed.
Yeah, I agree that the concept of existence outside of time and space to me doesn't seem plausible, and I think it's probably totally incoherent. I mean, to not exist in time is to say that something exists for 0 seconds. And if I say, George, you exist for 0 seconds, that means you don't exist.
Exactly. And the other thing with time is a measurement of motion. And anytime we use the word time, it's like, the motion of atoms interacting, the motion of the sun, it's always relative to the motion. So, like, to say something is outside of time is to say that nothing actually is happening. So yeah, that doesn't make sense.
Einstein famously asked, did God have a choice in creating the universe? Now, Einstein didn't have like the traditional God in mind, but he liked to, entertain the idea just for just for fun. And if you think about it, if God doesn't exist in time, then it never could have been the case that God existed in a state in which he did not intend to create our universe and wanted to create another universe or no universe. He must have always existed with the goal or intention to create our universe and not any other kind of universe or not universe. And the only way you can get the idea of decision making, contingent decision making, is you have to have time. We make decisions in time, and we think of them of being contingent. Well, the decision was based on X that happened in the past. But if God has no time, if He exists in a non-temporal state, however that makes sense, then it could never have been the case that God existed and then He desired, oh, I think I'll create a universe and I'll create this particular universe. It could never have been the case. It would have had to been the case that God always existed right from the beginning or from eternity or in some non-temporal frozen state with the desire and intention to create our specific universe. And it never could have been any other way because there's no possible counterfactual to that.
You're stuck in a situation if because a decision is always made on what happened in the past to lead to somebody wanting to do one thing instead of another. So if there is no time, if there is no past, if there's nothing that happened before God, because then there's absolutely no basis, and it would have to be basically a random choice, a causal, if you can even try to figure that one out.
Or it would have to simply just be a brute fact that God exists always in this state with the intention to create our universe, and not a universe that is even tiny bit different.
Right. And there would be no explanation for why this universe instead of another universe.
Yeah, because no theist will be able to say, well, God could have chosen to create another universe. He couldn't have, because that would require time in order to do so. He would have had to have a state where he said, what universe should I create? Well, let me weigh, possibility X, Y, and Z. Oh, I'll create Z. It couldn't have ever been that way. He would have always have had the decision to create universe Z, and no other possibility could have been actualized.
Right. The very idea when they try to say, well, God could have done this instead is saying God could have done otherwise, that was a genuine possibility, which is precisely betrays their belief in free will.
I just
And yeah,
thought
it
of
requires time.
Yeah, I just thought of another example of like a lot of theists who believe that God is all good and believe God has free will, don't realize the contradiction between that. In other words, like if God is all good, by definition, God has to do what's good. God cannot do what's not good. So again, this is using their logic against them. If you want to believe that God is all good, God cannot be all good and have free will at the same time.
Yeah, and then of course it gets into a whole discussion of what is good.
It's whatever God does.
Right. Is it good because God does it, or does God do it because it's good?
Yeah, and most theists hate entertaining the idea of brute facts. They just absolutely abhor it because once you allow brute facts into your way of thinking, then the universe could be a brute fact, and then there's absolutely no need for God. And most theists would really, really, really want to not go down that road. And so, to me, I think the theist is stuck between a rock and a hard place here. I really don't see how they can get out of this logical dilemma. And when I've challenged theists on this, basically the argument I get is the old saying, the Lord works in mysterious ways. Our puny, mortal, evolved primate brains just can't understand this stuff. Like we can't expect to figure this out. This is beyond our intellect. And they leave it at that. But to
Right.
me, that's just not satisfying.
Yeah, guys, I mean like I happen to be a pantheist, which is very, very different from the theist like, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And so like, in a certain sense, for example, like if you define God as everything, then the universe is everything. If you've got define God as all powerful, then the laws of nature are all powerful. But again, it's not the same God that most religions believe in, because like this God again doesn't have any more free will in the present than we do. This God has to be both good and evil because there's good and evil, and there's certain differences. I've got to get going in a few minutes, but like you guys can continue the podcast, all right?
All right, George.
All right. Thanks, George.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, see, what I wanted to say in response to that, though, is George is a lot of fun because this whole pantheism thing, equating God with the universe, is interesting. It's different from the kind of God that sends you to hell. That's I think, the very important thing that's different, which is why I can handle it because I mean, I had a problem with the Christian God that was blaming humans for what he made them do.
Yeah, I mean, there's been all attempts among Christians to liberalize that God and to make him like, oh, he's not gonna punish you or anything. He just wants you to be happy, more or less. The hippy dippy loving God, the tree hugging kind of God. And I mean, I would argue, yeah, that God is certainly better than the fire and brimstone angry God who gets pissed the moment two gay people do it in the naughty place. But I mean, it's on the right path to know God, which is, I think, eventually where we need to go in society. It's inching the way closer to know God, but I guess you're not gonna. It's unlikely that people who are very conservative in religious beliefs are gonna go from a very fundamentalist view to atheism overnight, or even in over a year. They'll go from fundamentalist Christianity to liberal Christianity to a kind of spiritual deism to then agnosticism to then atheism. And that's usually the path that people take when they come out of religion.
Yeah, I know that was kind of how it happened for me too. It was not by any means a quick thing. And so I guess it comes in stages. I mean, we can't expect, the zygote to turn into a 40-year-old adult, in a few seconds.
Do you think that the debate over free will eventually, over time, replace the debate over creationism?
I think it will.
Because it seems to me that the creationists are dramatically decreasing in numbers over every time they do like a poll, it gets less and less and less and less. And at some point, probably within the next 10, 15 years, there'll be like such a tiny minority of people that they'll be insignificant in any respect. But as the debate over free will enters a more of a mainstream arena and people take note that there is a debate over it, that the intuitive assumption that there is free will is not something that we can just take for granted as an axiom. When that debate heats up, it seems to me that that will be a debate that replaces evolution. Instead, maybe 20 years from now, we'll have, people debating free will and non-free will just as ferocious as they debate evolution and creationism.
Yeah, in fact, it'll be even more fierce because basically, what I don't think that creationism and evolution, practically speaking, makes that much of a difference as far as ethically for us, how we treat each other. Whereas I think that the free will belief has huge differences in our behavior because automatically when we believe in free will and that people are doing things we don't like and that they chose to do it all by themselves, that they're the first cause of it, well, then we blame them and we want to kill them or torture them in some way. But if we understand that nobody chooses anything, we tend to be more compassionate and we tend to dig deeper into what life is about and what ethics is. So I think it matters more, and that's why this debate should replace these other debates about creationism versus evolution or the existence of God, because quite simply, I don't think those debates actually matter that much.
They only matter to religious people, and only then a subset of religious people, fundamentalist religious people, who take a literal interpretation of their religious holy book. It only really matters to them. And to the scientific community, to intellectual people, educated people, progressive people, it's a non-issue. Doesn't even It's not even something that we even have to debate anymore. The debate is over. The nail in the coffin has been nailed in of creationism. It's a done deal. But I have a feeling that the same people who are going to be debating on the side of free will in the next coming decades, as this debate gets more mainstream, will be the same kind of people that are currently debating for creationism. It's going to be primarily religious people.
Yeah, I think you're right. And the reason I think you're right on that is because this concept of free will is so central to the idea of sin and deserving hell, and retribution, all these various things that are clearly part of these religions.
Exactly, because the concept of the traditional Christian hell really makes no sense on determinism. I mean, the person who's has the unlucky fortune of being born as a person determined to go to hell has no choice in the matter. They're simply just a pawn, in the game that God is playing. And you really cannot justify the idea of a person spending an eternity in hell through no fault of their own and claiming that God is morally perfect and just at the same time. Like that's just incoherent.
Right. So one of those has to give.
Either either God is evil, well, and the thing about some hardcore fundy Calvinists is they will, when pressed, they will admit, like, yeah, the God that I believe in, he's kind of an asshole, but hey, he's the boss and he has the power, so you better do what he says. Period.
Yeah, I mean, I like that level of honesty, I have to say.
It is a little bit more intellectually honest than the person who wants to say there is no free will and a God that sends you to hell for eternity is morally perfect. I mean, that to me is just like that's like trying to make a square circle.
Well, the reason that they get away with trying to say God is morally perfect is because they say God makes up morality, whatever he feels like at the time. So if God wakes up in the morning and says, you know what, rape is a really good thing. I'm going to declare that rape is good. Well, then it's good because God said so. So that's their system of morality. And that's why God always has to be morally perfect, no matter what God says or does.
Most theists that I've spoken to will try to avoid that the arbitrariness accusation of God's morality when it comes to debating morality. They'll say, well, God is intrinsically morally perfect. Therefore, everything he says is morally perfect, and he couldn't command you to do evil or anything like that. But if you're a traditional theist, like a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim, all you have to do is point to a verse in the Bible in which God is commanding someone to do something we would today consider evil. Like the Old Testament has the God commands the Jews to kill all the Canaanites, kill the men, women, children, everyone, down to the very last one. And I asked Christians, I said, well, if the Jews decided to just kill the Canaanites on their own, like if that was just a decision that they made within the tribe, would it have been moral? They would say no, because that would be people deciding to kill, for no reason. But then they say, well, if God commands them to do that very same exact thing, then it becomes good because it's God commanding you to do so, and God is morally perfect, and everything he does and says and commands is morally perfect. But that's the same exact thing as morality being, in a sense, arbitrarily decided by God. If something that is wrong to do on your own suddenly becomes right when God commands you to do that very same exact thing, then it is, in a sense, that whatever God commands is right. The first horn of the Euthyphro dilemma.
Yeah, see, and so, like, I think that a certain action is either right or wrong. It doesn't make a difference who does it or who says to do it. It's either right or it's wrong, and there's no person that can change that.
Yeah. So basically, here's how a lot of Christians argue this. They say God is by definition perfect. Yahweh is God. Therefore, everything Yahweh does and commands is perfect. Checkmate, atheist.
Oh, I know. It's really hilarious. But I think what's interesting about it is that, first of all, I mean, we generally disagree with the theistic idea of God being the standard of morality, this arbitrary morality that can just change. But either way, because we don't have free will, we don't have moral responsibility, even which once you establish the same morality, which I don't think the atheists and theists will ever have the same standard of morality they're going by. But either way, we can't blame anybody. We don't have a free will.
Yeah, and going back to free will, given that it is most likely the case that it's going to be religious-based beliefs that are going to be giving the most pushback against free will, that brings up an interesting, I guess, problem on our hands, on those of us who are advocates for getting rid of free will as something that is true, in that what are going to be the best tactics for us to, I guess, spread the message that there is no free will, given that religion is going to be the greatest pushback? Is it going to be that we have to kind of, I guess, critique religion first or debunk the religion first, and then once you debunk a person's religion, now you're making it much easier for them to come into the acknowledgement that there is no free will? Or are you going to have to make the case against free will first and emphasize that, and then have to have them on their own kind of deal with it in terms of their religion? Because it seems to me that the former would probably be the best method. You'd have to decrease their religiosity first, since that's going to be the largest pushback on free will. And then once you get them out of religion, then it's much easier to get them to acknowledge that there is no free will.
That's an interesting question because right now I'm not sure which is the most effective way.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's an open question. I think the former would probably be the best way, but that's just my hypothesis right now. I don't know. It's, to me, it is a bit of an open question because I Me and Mitch, we live here in New York, and we belong to an atheist meetup, and we hang out and we get together almost every week in an atheist group, and we're both, very knowledgeable on the free will topic, and I challenge other atheists on free will, and even atheists push back and say, oh no no no, we have free will. I make a decision when I choose Pepsi over Coke. It's me making the decision. That's my free will, and you don't know what you're talking about. So even among atheists who are essentially materialists, who don't believe in a soul or anything non physical interacting with the universe, even they accept a quasi or actual free will because it's been so ingrained in the culture. So even being an atheist could still make you believe that there's free will. I mean, it's not a guarantee, but I do think it makes it easier to convince an atheist that there is no free will than it is to convince a theist, because the atheist doesn't have the idea of a soul or a god or sin to try to use that as pushback.
I think you have a point there, but still, yeah, I think it's an open question and one that we might talk with our co-host on a future episode. We've just passed 32 minutes here, so I think we'll want to end this episode.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, that could be a future topic we can discuss.
All right, definitely. All right, you've been listening to Free Will, Science, and Religion. First, it was Chandler Klebs and George Ortega, but he had to leave. But then I continued it with Michael Walsh, and we got into all kinds of topics. So I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode, and stay tuned for more. Bye.